Contribution and name, then send it to 7197. Your views, our interviews on Spectrum, Radio 1 FM 90.
A very warm welcome. This is Spectrum on Radio 1. My name is Edmond Chizito, your host. On Spectrum tonight, has privatization done more harm than good?
Be the time for the country to raise this process. A debate has begun to rage about the privatization process in Uganda, with many people.
Current economic troubles do not in fact originate from mistakes carried out during the privatization process. Under pressure from the International Monetary Fund, Uganda sold off most of its state-owned entities as one of the requirements to reform the economy to ensure recovery. By the year 2005, privatization had reached its peak, with several utility companies, including power company UEB, being privatized. The argument then was that government was not good at doing business, and that funds being spent to keep entities afloat were required in other key sector investments. It was expected that the privatized entities would generate profits, pay more taxes, and create jobs. Now, a debate has begun about what happened during privatization, and if at all, the Ugandan people were misled to accept the process. In the ensuing debate, two schools of thought have emerged. Those calling for a total nationalization of vital entities, and others suggesting that the government of Uganda quicken the emplacement of the public-private partnership, or PPP. There are those asking government to halt privatization altogether and accountability carried out for the proceeds from the already privatized entities. All seem to arrive at the same point, though, that private players are more interested in profit than the welfare of society. So tonight we evaluate the privatization process to see if at all it has done more harm than good. Our guests tonight, Honorable Stephen Birahwa, Chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on the National Economy. You're most welcome, Honorable Birahwa.
Good evening, Radio 1 fraternity, and thanks so much, Edmund. Nice being here again.
Right. We also have Mr. Jim Mugunga, spokesman for the privatization unit. You're most welcome, Mr. Mugunga.
Thank you, Edmund, for the opportunity. Good evening, listeners.
Can you take us through the background to this process? How did it begin? What was the rationale?
Apparently, that's where probably the explanation for how the performance of privatization can actually be measured. The privatization process was born out of the need to reform the entire economy of the country. We tend to look at one aspect of privatization, which is the selling, as people prefer to call it. But by and large, the reform and of the economy, the entire economy, was hinged on a couple of pillars. The first one was streamline the operations of government. Two, streamline the performance and operations of the parastatal sector, as it was called then. Three, liberalize the economy. And four, ensure that the forex regime is as dynamic and competitive as it should be. So arising out of those pillars, government said if we get these together, if we act on these and streamline the operations around those pillars, then the economy will be on its feet, and probably we shall have what then was called a self-sustaining economy. Edmund, you remember the jargon. So those were the pillars. Now, privatization is not the end and is not the final solution. Privatization is part of the means. It's a vehicle. There are so many vehicles that lead to the Kampala city. They come from Mukono, they come from Gayaza, they come from all these places. But what happens? They converge at a certain point. Now, liberalization of the economy, privatization, freeing of the foreign exchange, we're all supposed to work in harmony and all leading us to a better and vibrant economy. That's the core of privatization. Now, fast forward to why did we then have to pick on privatization and the modes we used. There are three reasons for this. The first one is that the parastatal sector was completely, and I want to really be not cautious here, but completely on its deathbed. The parastatals,
like the entire economy.
Exactly. And the parastatals were functional, but they were functional because they were on a drip. I tend to call it drip. Subsidy from the treasury. Yeah. So your taxes, my taxes, the listeners' taxes were not going at those core areas where they were supposed to be going, but going to sustain companies that were, one, non-productive, two, highly populated by manpower that was not necessary.
Incompetent people hired by
Exactly.
relatives.
But beyond that, a lot of politicization. And of course, then the end result, which was a subsidy. So you have these gigantic corporations that existed with so many big numbers with less productivity. Their contribution to the GDP, their contribution to the livelihood of ordinary Ugandans were not there. But as ordinary Ugandans, we lived a falsified lifestyle because they employed our relatives. So we thought that actually they were producing and contributing to the economy. No. What was happening, government was borrowing from the treasury to sustain the parastatals. So your brother, my brother, who is not necessarily supposed to be in that company, was paid because you and me paid taxes. Now, going forward, government decides to rationalize these companies, and it picked on a couple of steps. In the short time we have, I wouldn't really go through this, but one of them was, are there companies in the economy that are sustained by government that are irrelevant? And if they are, can we get rid of them? 2, are there companies that are sustained by the taxpayer, but which should not actually be sustained by the taxpayer? Can't they be sustained by Edmond and Honorable in his private life? 3, are there companies where government feels that these are so strategic in nature that government has to stay there and sustain them, and so on and so forth? And to give you a quick example of these companies, for example, government says, supposing, remember the other pillars I talked about, supposing we work with liberalization and privatization together, can we, for example, detach a company like foods and beverages? Do we need to really have foods and beverages? If
it was a supermarket.
Exactly. It's a supermarket. It's a time of scarcity. We are working on the industrialization. We're getting people to invest in industries. We're getting the economy to be vibrant. We're freeing the foreign exchange. We are also making sure that the ordinary Ugandan operates that duka, that wholesale in Chikubo, and is free to import and export whatever he wants. Do we still therefore need foods and beverages? And the moment they looked at this and studied it and said no, in our wisdom, we said foods and beverages does not fit in the new school of thought, and therefore that one, set it aside. Now foods and beverages goes, but how does it go? It will go with the workforce. Now, that's the downside to privatization. So you have redundancies.
Laying of staff.
Laying of staff. And people, of course, there was an outcry. Remember, who are being laid off? My relatives, your relatives. But how do they get there? Are they qualified? Are they wrong? Exactly. So people tend to forget that side of things. I said people lost jobs. So the second component of so those are companies. Foods and beverages is one of them. Uganda Transport Company, the buses is another one. Do you have to have a government company that runs buses between here and Burisa? And you have a politician like Honorable Stephen standing up on during campaign time and saying, can I please vote me, I'll bring you buses. Right. So we say no, open up, get so many Ugandans to operate the transport sector, and so on and so forth. So those are the ones which we scrapped. But there are others, for example, communication. We say, why don't we find a way of empowering people to invest in communication? Radios, mobile telephony, and so on, and value addition in telephony. And when we did that, Uganda Broadcasting Corporation ceases, by then called the Radio Uganda, ceases to be a standalone monopoly and Uganda Television. But you have Radio 1, you have Uganda Television, you have UBC, you have Radio 2, and so on and so forth. And what you're creating here is a vibrancy in the sector, but you're also creating opportunities that are driven by market forces and private sector. You also indirectly stimulating the government companies to compete. Therefore, one, they are going to invest in equipment, they are going to create efficiencies, but they are going to rationalize the operations. On the other hand, the Treasury is saying, Radio 1 is vibrant, therefore UBC, no excuse for you not to make your own money and sustain yourselves. Right. So those are two scenarios. You have the scrapped companies, you have the ones where government has remained and facilitated the environment to open it up, but then you have the strategic sectors where government says, look, for us to ensure that this sector moves, transport sector, for us to ensure that rails work, you're not going to see so many private people investing in a rail line. They may operate it, but they're not going to invest in building a new rail line. So what do? We get in the private people to manage, but government takes full responsibility for the infrastructure. So generally, what I'm trying to do here is to give you an oversight of what has actually happened over the years. Now, do we see an impact out of that? That's a debate probably for the next round.
Very briefly, do you think there are mistakes that were done? Can you give us those very, very briefly?
I wouldn't say it was 100% achieved.
Well, broadly, in terms
broadly, I can say there were over 80% positives, and there have been a couple of issues that we could have done better.
We'll look at the 20% in your estimation. Honorable Birahwa, what's your evaluation of the project?
Thank you so much. I want to thank Jim Mugunga for laboring so much to explain to the listeners how far we've come. Clearly, I would like to agree with him on one area that at that point in time, liberalization, which does not only talk about privatization, was a prescription which possibly was dealing with the structural bottlenecks of the country at that point in time, the 90s, the post-economic collapse. But also ideologically we must concede it comes at a time of the end of the Cold War, where the Bretton Woods twins, the World Bank and the IMF, gave us the bitter pills. Nobody should come here and say it was purely a Ugandan choice. We were largely 95% donor dependent, and therefore the structural adjustment programs, which among others include liberalization, privatization, retrenchment, was a way of what you can call the rollback of the state. So divestiture was one of them. And therefore we need to understand privatization as a component of divestiture. That the state is obese, is overloaded, and therefore should disengage where private sector should perform. Now, the detail which Jim is not giving us is that privatization does not, liberalization does not necessarily mean outright sell. That Uganda had a choice to decide which core activities of infrastructure nature, of utility nature, government had to remain with, and I thank government for retaining National Water and Sewerage Corporation, which is still making
we have to thank God. They sold the power company. They could very easily have sold the water group. We thank God for that.
So, and it's making money not only in Uganda, but even it's providing consultancy in the region. For example, there is no way we can wait for the private sector to be the one to provide for us energy. And Jim is aware. The Ujagali project started with Uganda, $100 million from the energy fund. That shows you how slow the private sector can be to come in critical areas. Because energy that is not only a prime mover of economic growth and development, but it borders security. You don't need to know. You don't need to be an expert to know that the challenge of competitiveness of this country depends on the mode of transport to the sea, this being a landlocked country. And therefore RVR failure to some of us was expected. We had a problem, some of us even to give a partial risk guarantee to them in Parliament.
That's the comment that
because we knew
RVR
this is a time, of course they call it a concessionaire, but those are semantics. So what I'm talking about, that you can privatize, outright sell foods and beverage, no regrets. But you can outsource management. Bukatet was managing Kinyara for 15 years and there's no single year they made a loss.
True.
What's the justification of selling Kinyara's dollars? And recently, that was wrong for PU and whoever was an expert advising government. Sheraton, Apollo Milton was making profit. For all the time, they never made a loss a single day. What was the motivation of giving Midrock, which did not even pay any money up front? These are the failures, these are the excesses we are saying were wrong. You have talked of the need for competition. Our case was not competition. UCB was not given a chance to compete. UCB was sold. So the right way, I have no problem with liberalization. But I'm saying there should have been an opportunity for competition. The other, apart from outsourcing management, which I'm talking about, the other third component is called the management buyout. Jim should know about this.
Yes.
You allow those who have been managers like Booker Tet, like Sheraton, to acquire shares and therefore continue having a stake both in management and in shareholding. I'm talking about best practice in the world. And the final option is when you also allow citizens to buy shares. So really I'm saying this mix of privatization was not dispensed in this country. We had a hankering of outright sale, and I think it's wrong for anybody to come here to defend those mistakes. What is important is to say now that we are of age, now that Uganda is only getting 27% donor financing of our budget, now that we're expecting some money from our oil resources, what can we do to revive, for example, a Uganda Development Corporation model?
We'll talk about that.
Whereby we are going to have the state owning some critical areas like energy, like railways. I strongly say in the Albertine area, tourism more than the oil part talking about, so that government owns these investments but does not have to manage them. There are so many expert managers in this country. There are Ugandans who are working for big international managers out there.
Right.
And they can, including him, they can work as managers of national corporations. For example, we cannot continue with this oil industry, which is now private sector led. You cannot have a refinery owned by private